Dame Gertrude More, the great-great-granddaughter of Sir Thomas More, the famous chancellor who took on Henry VIII and refused to sign an oath of loyalty in agreeing that Henry was now the head of the church in England, an unfortunate time in history, and thank God we have probably gotten beyond that. But she comes from a family that deeply valued education for daughters as well as for sons, and that will include her own generation of siblings and cousins that will find themselves with every opportunity for an education. This was also a time of recusancy. Now, that's a fancy term, but it means that some Catholics, really more of the aristocracy or minor royalty, the everyday person basically didn't get caught up into this. But to recuse yourself is like a judge recusing themselves from a case, excusing themselves because of a conflict of interest. In this case, they felt that they could not choose between Rome and England and could not sign an oath of loyalty to Henry VIII. And over the course of several years, Henry will shut down all the Benedictine monasteries, men and women, as well as driving the Jesuits out of England. And really, a lot of it about the monasteries and the Jesuits was the fact that they held a lot of political power and could have influenced the direction of the country away from his desire to break away from Rome and form his own English Catholic Church, is what he would call it. Benedictines, some slipped out to the continent. The Jesuits were driven out of England to the continent, and most ended up around Douai, which is a city in northern France, still there today. The monastery stone was highly valuable to Henry, used as bribes to buy off people who maybe were waffling, but he wanted and needed their support for his campaign. Why the stone? Because they used it to build their new manor houses. So when you go to England now and you see some of these really old monasteries, it's really oftentimes just the nave that has survived because now it's the local parish church, but once was a Benedictine monastery. But Dame Gertrude really ought to be better known than she is, and that's maybe kind of my issue and why I'm bringing her forward. She made a significant contribution to spirituality, and particularly to Benedictine spirituality. Nothing wrong with other traditions of spirituality, but our tradition is based on Lectio Divina and on contemplative prayer. That doesn't mean we're not aware of other forms and maybe privately practice some of that, but Lectio Divina, contemplation, chanting the office is core to who we are. And she made a significant contribution, keeping alive that thread of tradition in a time of great turmoil, because we have the Protestant Reformation, which needed to happen. Rome was quite corrupt at the time, but where this is the tragic time of wars of religion, and so there was upheaval everywhere. And how does the Holy Spirit keep that one thread alive? And it's through the lives of some people. She would finally grow to claim her in authority after some struggles, especially with scrupulosity. But her writings are slowly being discovered anew. They are locatable, but still not that easy because unfortunately major presses don't see the point of publishing her works. But you can always email me if you want to know where to find some of her writings. This is that sad time, as I mentioned, of the Roman and English church not getting along with each other. She will end up going to Douai along with some of her cousins and some other daughters of minor aristocracy with the intent of establishing Benedictine monasteries in the continent, specifically English speaking, again, keeping the tradition alive in the hopes of being able to return to England one day. She's described as precocious, intelligent, with a quick wit, very extroverted apparently, and mischievous in nature. I guess that feeds into the sense of adventure, going off to a foreign land in order to start a whole new adventure. In 1621 is when she debarks for Douai. And from there, they will go to Cambrai, which is a city in present-day Belgium. And they will establish a Benedictine monastery, the first of about 6 or 8, named Our Lady of Consolation. In December 31st of 1623 is when they're clothed. That means entering the novitiate. And January 1st, 1625 is when they make their initial profession. She serves as cellarer. That means that she's responsible for both the material and the financial well-being of the community. And that's kind of a natural choice, given that she is Cressaker's daughter, and given that she apparently had a good business mind, because given limited resources, the community did well. She, of course, did find something that they could do. I will get to that towards the end, that would make good money for their monastery, to both build and expand their monastery, support new novices coming in, and really to have something for the poor. Despite being cloistered, they were cloistered. This is a time when men had issues with women's independence and women's sexuality, and Grill was built into the monastery, whether the women liked it or not. It was the need of men to control women, and at this area of time, it would be primarily the Jesuits, who, of course, have no experience of being a woman, let alone a Benedictine, decided they had to be kept behind that grill, claiming it's for their protection, but it was really about control. But that doesn't mean that lock didn't work on both sides, because these women understood that the only people really concerned about their care was themselves. And the tradition is that for many of these women's Benedictine monasteries that were put behind a grill, the back door had a two-way lock. The women just contacted the local locksmith, who had a lot of sympathy, created a two-way lock, and they could slip out in widow's attire to attend to their business. They had to, because very few people were going to care, especially in their case, their family being in England. The distance would have been too great. But Dame Gertrude did suffer from scrupulosity. This is kind of a pathological guilt. It's really an awful thing for people to try to get over, especially if you have a high IQ. It's a pathological guilt or obsession with things associated with moral or religious issues, i.e., she would see sin everywhere, with the help of the Jesuits, who kept pointing out her sin to her and to the other sisters. It wasn't just her, which is very unfortunate. Their Jesuit chaplains insisted that the nuns place great emphasis on examination of thoughts and actions, which only encouraged her tendencies toward scrupulosity. Mental prayer just was not working for her. It might have for a few of her sisters, but my reading is that she wasn't the only one in her house who really, really struggled with this mental prayer. I'm told that it was actually life-giving for active sisters or apostolic sisters, but not for women whose whole lives were behind a grill and about contemplation. It left her depressed. It really did. She had remained outwardly lively and talkative, but how within she was really struggling with, and therefore questioning whether she really had a call to religious life, if this is all there was. The good news is that a Benedictine by the name of Augustine Baker, who was something of a nonconformist, was sent to her monastery to teach some monastic classes, something the Jesuits were not qualified to do. And thank God, because he ended up becoming a great friend to the sisters. He ended up having some battles with the Jesuits that will play out in the latter part of Dame Gertrude's life. But he encouraged the sisters towards silent interior prayer and to trust their interior knowing. She debated with Augustine quite fiercely, but more maybe out of fun, because she had quite a keen intellect, and maybe she didn't have so many people in the house that she could debate theological issues with. And the Jesuits, of course, were not going to allow her to debate anything, because their word was law. That's it. But he encouraged her towards interior knowing. Eventually, she confessed to him that she was struggling with despair and depression, but she finally began to experience intense spiritual consolations. He just kind of gently encouraged her to go within, go within, go within. And finally, she was able to let go of some of her scrupulosity and trust her interior knowing. He was basically encouraging her and some of her sisters away from formalized prayer into this interior quiet knowing. Instead of trying to overcome faults by self-analysis, which in her case would just tie her up into a knot, he proposed that she just gently do what she could and trust God for the rest. Augustine taught her that living her way of love would itself reveal the depths of her spiritual being. And apparently that actually worked. And we'll find that out when her writings are revealed. Her natural tendency was to rest upon and savor her known felt experience and love for God, and frankly, God's love for her. A term at this time that was used is called spiritual conversations or sacred conversations, which was her phrase for formal prayer and informal prayer, which enabled growth into her true self and to humility. She refers to the grace in all occasions. Grace is everywhere. And when you live with scrupulosity, that becomes really important. Mercy and grace. Discretion and discernment cultivates wisdom and a listening ear. Remember Benedict's, listen with the ear of your heart. Dame Gertrude, this is actually kind of funny. After Dame Gertrude dies in 1623, they discover that Dame Gertrude had little pieces of paper all over her cell, slipped in books, slipped under here, slipped in there. And they started gathering them together as they're cleaning out her cell. And then other sisters start volunteering little sheets of paper where she wrote to them about, something she was aware of for them, or a blessing for them, or a teaching for them, answering some of their questions. Possibly she became kind of a wisdom figure in her house. But also these sisters met with women in the village for spiritual direction through that girl. And so these women in the village, after they heard of Dame Gertrude's death, started bringing forward what she had shared with them in writing. And Augustine Baker and some of the sisters start pulling together all these sheets of paper, and they pull them together into a book that is known as her spiritual exercises. Not in the sense of the Jesuit spiritual exercises in everyday life, but her own, like in the footsteps of the great Benedictine Gertrude. It was a set of spiritual exercises for what helped her to draw closer to God. So therefore, this might maybe help you. She was not an authority that said, do this, do that. She was just suggesting this might work, this might help. I encourage you in this area. You're doing great in that area. And that is available. It's a tough one to find, but it is out there because some scholars have been working with it. She was also a poet of some sort, and so a collection of her poetry has been recently released by one of the scholarly presses. But besides her spiritual exercises, Augustine Baker was so impressed with her spiritual growth and maturity that he ended up writing The Life and Death of Dame Gertrude Moore. That too is available, not the easiest thing to find, but it is out there because recent scholars, Ben Wecking especially, have been working on making her writings available to a contemporary audience. One of the things found is that she wrote an apology. That was the term used in those days. When Augustine Baker went on trial, in the midst of all these religious wars and everything going on, they had to stop and put him on trial for unorthodoxy, Jesuits judging a Benedictine, but also some of his Benedictine superiors were growing uneasy with what he was saying. She writes an apology, which is a several-page letter explaining how important and helpful his teachings were for her and her experience of his teachings. Between she and several other sisters who also wrote apologies, Augustine Baker is exonerated and he returns to Cambrai to continue his journey with the sisters. She does die of smallpox in 1633. Interesting, the business she set them up in was a printing press. Now, if you're a woman of a certain class, or you want to make sure everybody understands that you are well-read, you had one of these bags that pulled at the top, that were a string bag that pulled in tight at the top, and you would lay it on your wrist, and down it would be this bag, and inside would be one of these books that Dame Gertrude's monastery printed. They ran a printing press and sold these books, and that's how they made their living. I've seen them in England. They're really kind of interesting because they're kind of awkward for my modern day hands to use, but they're kind of boxy, almost like 4-inch square, plus 3 inches wide. They're just kind of an interesting configuration. But what scholars tell us is that because the sisters refused to let the Jesuits behind the grill to find out what books they had in their library and what books they were printing. So how they disseminated them and sold them to these ladies without the Jesuits knowing, that's a story for someone else to figure out. But the scholars tell us that because they refused to allow the Jesuits behind the grill, that is the only reason we have the writings of Dame Gertrude Moore and Sir Walter Hilton. In the early days of Henry's battles with Rome, and trying to remove any papal, they would say popist, influences in England, they burned books. Unfortunate, but they did burn books, anything that smacked too much of popish thinking at the time. And now everyone loves Dame Gertrude Moore, and the English mystics are making a renaissance right at the moment, but we would have been missing at least these two from our library shelves if it wasn't for these great gals. Now the French Revolution comes along, and instead of executing them for whatever reason, the French government said you can leave your monastery and get out of the continent as long as you leave without your habit. And so the local ladies pulled together some old widows' habits and helped the sisters sew the books into the hems and other places in the dresses, letting out the waistline, of course. And these women hobbled down to the dock. They must have just looked like a riot because they were lumpy, 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 filled with these books, getting on the boat to go to England. When Catholics are hated in France, England welcomes them back. When England hates Roman Catholics, France welcomes them. That's kind of the long history. So these women make their way back to England, meeting their lifelong dream, which is to reestablish Benedictine monasteries. And two of the monasteries, Stanbrook Abbey, which is now up in the Yorkshire Forest, and Colwich, which now has joined Stanbrook, is where I first saw these books, are two of the daughters descending from these English Benedictine houses, and very specifically Dame Gertrude Moore. I hope you can find your way to reading some of her writings.